Hey everyone, it's Hannah Taylor from HR Images. In today's video, we'll be talking to you about the Sony 2870 f2 GM lens. So stay tuned. So it's been a while since I've done actually gear reviews. So just full disclosure, I am a Sony digital imaging advocate. So I am sponsored by Sony Australia, but these reviews are actually my own thoughts, my own impressions of what I think of their products. So I'm not paid to do any of these, as a lot of you know and who have been following me for years, that I base my reviews on real world experience. If I don't like something, I will say I don't like it and I say why I don't like it. For me, it's always about the honesty of it and how it performs in the real world. So if you look in here, we've got the 2870 f2 versus the 2470 GM Mark 1. Now, I don't have the GM Mark 2. I did borrow these from Sony. At the time, the GM Mark 2 was already out on loan, so they sent me this. I was using this originally for my events, christenings, and weddings, but I did get my hands on this and I really wanted to test it out. So I shot a whole christening just on this lens, so no other lenses. As a lot of you would know, I intend to use prime lenses, so it'll be a 35 and an 85 mil, or a 50 mil at the house, but generally it's a 35 and 85 that I would use right throughout. So it's a f1.4. Now, some people have said to me, "Oh, you're crazy, shoot a zoom lens, you don't have to worry about changing, yada, 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 blah, 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 whatever, whatever." But everybody has their own opinion. My opinion, the reason I shoot primes is I still feel that primes kind of give you that artistic approach. So with a prime, because you're zooming in and out with your legs, you intend to look at things differently opposed to what you can in a zoom lens. Zoom lenses, I've been calling it lazy lens. Why? Because you sit in one spot and you zoom in and out. Only way what you really got to do is just move side to side just to make sure you get what you want in shot, and then you can zoom in and frame your shot. Whereas prime, you're doing more than that. But for me, primes, I feel like it opens up my mind a bit more to be able to get that creative style of shot, because you are framing with just a fixed focal length. You're shooting at f1.4 in a prime, and that it actually gives a different look in terms of the bokeh and the separation. Now, in saying that, the f2 lens does actually perform really well in terms of autofocus, as well as in the bokeh of f2. But first, we'll get in terms of the build quality. So just to give you an idea, this lens weighs 918 grams, while the GM Mark II of the 2470 weighs 695 grams. So there is a big difference in terms of the weight. But if you're comparing it to the GM Mark I versus the 2870 f2, this is actually lighter than the GM Mark I. But the Mark II is obviously a lot lighter, a lot more compact. Filter thread on the 2870 is 86 millimeters, whereas the 2470 f2.8 GM Mark II is an 82 millimeter thread. So because of the f2 aperture, this is a lot wider than the 2470. So you can just see it comparing it the Mark I, comparing it to that, you see the difference in the size. Minimum focus distance on this lens. As I'm talking to you about this lens, I'll be showing you some side-by-side, some images that I've captured using this lens in a real world scenario. So my one is not shooting a paper on a wall or any of that sort of thing. It's actually real world experience in an event where things can happen unexpectedly and how well the lens can perform and keep up. This lens will focus at a minimum focus distance at 0.38 meters, while the Mark II GM of the 2470 focuses as a minimum distance of 0.21 meters. The 2470, you do get closer than the 2870. So you will get nicer sort of macro shots, as you want to say, like ring shots and that with the 2470 GM Mark II, opposed to this, because you can get a little bit more closer. And it's surprisingly, because the distance does make a bit of difference. In terms of the GM, obviously the signature look, the signature features, so you got the aperture ring. You do have the D-click on and off. So if you're doing video, you can have it nice and smooth. And if you are doing photos, you can have the click on. Now, personally, with the photos, I like to have the click on, so I know that I've changed the aperture and it's sort of harder to knock opposed to having it smooth. But video-wise, because you don't want that jerk, you tend to use the smooth in changing aperture. You do have the 2 focus hold buttons, your AF manual focus switch, and you got a smooth tight. So at the moment it's smooth, so which is the zoom, and you can have it tight, which doesn't zoom as fast when you're pushing it because it's got that bit of firmness to it. But I think this feature is kind of good, especially in video, because when you're zooming in the smooth, you don't want to actually zoom further than you intended to, especially if you want that nice soft zoom out and zoom in. But at the same time, you want to do it very slow. So the tight feature does help in that sort of feature. So it gives that, like, as you can see, when you're doing it, it's slow. You can go slow without it sort of kind of speeding up in terms of the having it in the smooth feature. And they're both weather sealed, the 2870 and the 2470 GM Mark II. So that's more on the build quality of this lens. Now, let's talk about the aperture. For an f2.8 to an f2, for me, I'm actually still on the fence on whether or not I'm going to go with the 2870 or I'm going to get the 2470 Mark II. So if you're shooting video, the f2 makes more sense opposed to the f2.8, because that way you're allowing more light into your video opposed to the f2.8, especially when you're doing like low light events. Now, in terms of still, whether or not you want that difference of, would you sacrifice that 4mm and get the f2, or would you sacrifice the f2 and get the extra 4mm? That's where you sort of kind of outweighing the balance. Now, this christening, I have been shooting it just with the 2870. Now, there were times where I wish I had the 24. I needed that little bit extra wide, and I couldn't step further back. But it's not a deal breaker. The f2 does give you that nice, stunning bokeh as well. If you look at this shot, I shot this at the christening, the house preparation. I got the parents and the bub in on the bed, and I grab a shot. This is actually shot at f2. I love how that the parents as well as the child is in focus, whereas some lenses, when you shoot at f2 and you're focusing in the center, so the bub is in the center and the parents are on either side. Some lenses, you get that softness on the side, so the parents aren't as sharp as bub, but in terms of the 2870, it actually is sharp throughout the frame, wide open, which is what I really, really did like, because nothing sort of defeats the purpose when you're shooting like a group shot and you want to shoot wide open, have that bit of background separation, that you will be able to have your whole frame in focus. And as you can see with the other images, as I'm sharing, where the bed was situated, the window was behind the parents and bub, and giving that nice backlight. So I did notice with this lens, especially when the background is very bright, it actually holds its focus. So some lenses, when you focus on a subject and they're very heavily backlit from natural lighting, and you tend to sort of lose the focus because there's not much contrast for the focus point to catch, the 2870 actually still caught the people, even though it was heavily backlit. So for example, there was a window behind in the church, and I wanted to focus on the godmother and bub, and it actually caught on nicely. So you minimize the contrast of that because of the amount of highlights that are coming in, but it still retained its focus, and the quality of this lens actually is really, really well done. You can see some of these other images where I've done like close-up shots and showing some of the bokeh and the background separation at 70mm. For f2, this is actually a stunning lens at f2. And if you look at these group shots, this is shot at f4. Even like at f4, you getting the whole group is in focus. Like when I was shooting, when you have some third-party lenses, if you shoot f4, depending on how far or how level they are, even though the lens can tend to get softer as it on the outskirts of the center area, where the f4, it does retain the whole area in focus. So you're getting everybody in focus and sharp, which is good, because last thing you want to do is you give an image to a client, it's a group shot, you shot at f4, you have half the group in focus and the other group they blurred out or they're out of focus, and it's like, what's going on there? It looks a bit weird. And that's what I liked about this lens as well. How it holds, retains its sharpness right across at even at 4 and f2 at f2 as well. So wide open as well as f4, you're getting a nice focus in that focal plane. As a lot of you see my style of image and shooting, I do like to shoot wider apertures in venues, unless you're doing a group shots or different type of scenarios. So each scenario I do will depends on what aperture I shoot. So depending on the lighting, things like that. So a lot of venues, especially reception halls. So like in this christening, the lights were off, everyone was dancing, it was dark, so just had a little bit of light. I like to sort of kind of minimize as I can on flash because I don't want flash to be the overpower and it looks sort of unnatural. So I like to try and keep it as natural looking as I can. And when you're shooting in a bit of a higher ISO as well as in a wider aperture, the flash acts as a fill more just to break up the shadow. So it's not brightening the whole area. So I've seen photographers when they do event, they use flash, they focus so much on flash that the image looks just weird because you got that whole flash brightening up the whole area. Whereas if you see these images, you still retain that darkness of the venue. You have that nice bokeh at f2 in the background and that fill flash just to kind of break in the shadows and allow the subject that I'm focusing on to be illuminated a bit more to show on my images. And which is why I'm sort of leaning towards this. Now, in terms of price, this is retail around 5,300, the 2870 f2, whereas the GM Mark II 2470, I think it's retail 2,300, roughly Australian dollars. This is in Australia, so I'm going on Australian dollars. The GM Mark II. So you are having a hefty price tag in between. Now, this lens is not for everybody. I'll be plain out and say it. You got a lot of hobbyists that will like, look, it's a great lens, but it's not for me. I can't afford it. It's too expensive, which is understandable. Then you'd have the option of the 2470 GM Mark II. For a professional use, as of myself, or even a videographer, the 2870 f2 is definitely worth looking into, especially at the f2 aperture. For video, I know a lot of videographers have gotten rid of the 2470 GM Mark II just to get the 2870. So they're sacrificing that 4mm because of the f2 aperture for video. Obviously, with video, it's not like photos where you can add flash. And if you're in venues or scenarios where you can't add LED lights, you're going to be relying on ISO and your f-stop. Whereas photography, you can sort of balance it about. So that is my first impression of this lens. And look, I will say straight up, it is an amazing lens and it performs very, very well. Again, it comes back to the budget, whether you want to sacrifice a 4mm to get the f2 aperture, or you want to sacrifice the aperture and gain the 4mm. So it comes back down to personal preference and what you shoot and what you're planning to do. Do subscribe to my YouTube channel, like and share this video. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook, HR Images. I do have links below with my Facebook groups where I constantly host events. If you are in Sydney, there is a Sony Alpha Sydney group that I also run where I do promote all those events. If you'd like to join in, do join the groups as well. I'm constantly active, constantly posting. So if you do want to see the type of images I capture and the lenses I use and the quality I can produce with these lenses, do follow my social media as well. And until then, guys, I hope you did enjoy this video and we'll catch you on future reviews. See you guys.